You're already in the argument. You're not listening anymore. You stopped listening about 30 seconds ago. And somewhere underneath the words coming out of your mouth, a quieter part of your brain has already decided who's right. It decided before the argument started, possibly before breakfast, and right now it's doing something that feels exactly like thinking, but isn't. It's scanning, sorting, tossing out anything that doesn't fit and filing away anything that does. You're not processing evidence, you're building a case. There's a difference, and the fact that you can't feel the difference is the entire problem. Here's what's actually happening in that room. Your partner, or your colleague, or whoever drew the short straw and ended up on the other side of this conversation is saying something. The words are entering your ears. Your brain is receiving them. But somewhere between reception and comprehension, there's a filter running. One you didn't install consciously. One you can't turn off by deciding to be more open-minded. One that has been quietly shaping every opinion you've held since you were old enough to hold opinions. It's deciding, before you decide, what counts as a real point and what counts as noise. What lands as evidence and what lands as bad faith. And here's the thing that should unsettle you. It's fast. Faster than awareness. By the time you consciously process what the other person said, the filter has already done its work. You're not responding to what they said. You're responding to the version of it your brain chose to let through. This is confirmation bias, not a character flaw, not stubbornness, though it produces stubbornness as a side effect. Not something that happens to less intelligent people while you glide above it on a current of pure logic. It's architecture. It's the way the hardware runs. And you have it exactly as much as everyone else in every room you've ever been in, which is to say completely and in every direction. In 1960, a psychologist named Peter Wason gave people a simple task. He showed them a sequence of 3 numbers, 2, 4, 6. He told them the sequence followed a rule. Their job was to figure out the rule by generating their own sequences and asking whether each one fit. Simple enough. What Wason found was not simple. Nearly every subject immediately formed a hypothesis, usually something like ascending even numbers, and then proceeded to test it by generating sequences that confirmed it. 4, 6, 8, yes. 10, 12, 14, yes. They racked up confirmations and felt increasingly certain. What almost none of them did was try to break their hypothesis. Nobody threw out 1, 2, 3, or 7, 8, 9 to see if those fit too. Because they did fit. The actual rule was just any ascending sequence. The subjects had latched onto a specific answer and spent their testing budget proving themselves right, never once trying to prove themselves wrong. They finished the task confident. They were also wrong. And here's the part that stays with you. They were not careless. They were not stupid. They were doing exactly what brains do. They were running the filter. Wason's experiment is almost 65 years old, and it has been replicated and extended and mapped onto every domain of human decision-making you can name, and the result is always the same. People seek confirming evidence. They weight it more heavily when they find it. They remember it more clearly afterward, and they discount, dismiss, or simply fail to notice information that points the other way, not because they're dishonest, because the brain is running a background process that was never designed for accuracy. It was designed for coherence, for keeping the internal model of the world intact and functional so you can keep moving through the day without stopping to reevaluate everything from scratch every 30 seconds. It's efficient. It's fast. It is genuinely useful in a huge range of situations. And in the specific situation of trying to actually understand something true, it is quietly catastrophic. Now here's the part where your self-concept takes a small hit, and I'm going to deliver it without apology because you're smart enough to handle it. Intelligence does not protect you from this. In fact, in a measurable, documented, deeply irritating way, higher intelligence makes it worse. Not because smart people are more biased in their conclusions, but because they are significantly better at building post hoc justifications for conclusions the bias already delivered. A smarter brain is a more capable rationalization engine. It can construct an airtight-sounding argument for a position it arrived at emotionally before the conversation started, and it can do it faster, and it can do it more convincingly. If you have ever felt the particular satisfaction of dismantling someone else's argument piece by piece and Felt certain that satisfaction was evidence of your own clear thinking? I have some news about that feeling. The filter isn't running in your conscious mind. That's what makes it so persistent. Neuroscientists looking at brain imaging have found that the anterior cingulate cortex, a region involved in processing conflict and error, shows activation when people encounter information that contradicts their existing beliefs. In other words, your brain is flagging belief inconsistent information as a threat, not a puzzle to be solved, not interesting new data, a threat, something to be neutralized. And so you neutralize it. You find the flaw in the source. You decide the person saying it has an agenda. You acknowledge it technically while mentally filing it in a drawer you never open. You don't do this consciously. The threat response happens first. The reasoning comes after, shaped by the response. There's a study from 2015 published in Science by Bakshi and colleagues that tracked what people actually do on social media when they have a choice about what to read. They found people spend significantly more time with content that confirms their existing views, not because an algorithm forced them to. The study controlled for that, but because when given a choice, that's what people choose. Given a menu, you order the thing you already like. And every time you do, the filter gets a little more practice. The groove gets a little deeper. The model of the world you're operating from gets a little more defended and a little less accurate. So go back to that argument. The one that opened this. Both of you walked into that room already knowing who was right. Both of you were scanning the conversation for ammunition. Both of you were experiencing your own position as rational and the other person's position as frustratingly obtuse, which is exactly the symmetrical experience confirmation bias produces in two people with opposing views talking to each other. You weren't having an exchange of evidence. You were running two confirmation loops simultaneously in the same room, each one invisible to the person inside it. That's what this is. That's what it does. And the reason it matters, the reason this goes beyond being an interesting footnote in a psychology textbook, is that this filter is running right now on the things you believe about your money, your relationships, your career, the people you trust, the people you don't. The question isn't whether you're doing it, you are. The question is whether you're going to keep doing it blind. So now you know the filter exists. Good. Knowing it exists is not enough. Not even close. But we'll get to that. First, let's talk about how deep this thing actually runs. Because if you think confirmation bias is just about stubbornly holding opinions, you've barely scratched the surface of what's happening inside your skull. The filter doesn't just shape what you believe. It shapes what you notice, what you look for, how you weigh evidence when you find it, and what you remember afterward. It's not one bias. It's a whole operating system running on top of your conscious mind, and your conscious mind is mostly unaware it's there. Here's where it gets precise. The filter runs at the level of attention. Before you reason about something, before you evaluate it, before you decide whether it's credible, your brain has already sorted it. Relevant or irrelevant. Threat or confirmation. This happens fast, faster than thought. And the sorting criteria isn't truth, it's fit. Does this match what I already believe? If yes, let it through. If no, flag it, neutralize it, move on. Peter Wason figured this out in 1960 with a test so simple it's almost insulting, and the results were so consistent they've been making researchers uncomfortable ever since. He gave people a sequence, 2, 4, 6. He told them it followed a rule. Find the rule. Test as many sequences as you want. He'd tell them whether each one fit, and when they were confident they had it, they should say so. Nearly every subject locked onto a hypothesis immediately, ascending even numbers, most of them, and then spent their testing budget proving it. 4, 6, 8, yes, 20, 22, 24, yes. They piled up confirmations and felt increasingly certain. What almost no one did was try to break their own hypothesis. Nobody tried 1, 3, 5. Nobody tried 40, 20, 10. Because those would have told them the actual rule, which was just any ascending sequence, and their brain had no interest in finding the actual rule. It had already decided on a rule. It wanted to be right. It tested for rightness, found it, and stopped. Confident, wrong. That's not a story about bad scientists. That's a story about you. Every day, in every domain where you think you're gathering information, but are actually gathering confirmation. Now here's the part that should genuinely bother you. The Lord Ross and Lepper study from 1979 took two groups of people, one group that supported capital punishment, one group that opposed it, and gave both groups the exact same packet of research. Same studies, same data, same mixed evidence pointing in multiple directions. Both groups read everything. Then, both groups rated the quality of the research they'd just read. And here's what happened. Each group rated the studies that confirmed their existing position as more rigorous, more methodologically sound, more credible. Each group rated the studies that contradicted their position as weaker, flawed, less trustworthy. Same studies, opposite ratings. And after reading all of it, after being exposed to more evidence, both groups became more extreme in their original positions, not less. More information made them more certain in opposite directions. Read that again. More evidence made both sides more polarized. Not because the evidence was bad, because the filter processed it that way. You cannot think your way out of a filter that operates before thinking begins. This is the intellectual vertigo moment. The instinct when you learn about confirmation bias is to think, well, I'll just get more information, read more, be more thorough, expose myself to different perspectives. And what the research says very clearly is that this instinct is almost entirely useless without structural support, because the filter doesn't care how much information you consume. It processes all of it through the same screen. More input, same output. More evidence, more certainty in whatever you already believed. You can read everything ever written and come out the other end more convinced of the thing you walked in with, feeling completely justified, having genuinely engaged with the material. That's not a hypothetical. That's what the data shows. The bias is also perfectly symmetrical, which is worth sitting with. Political belief research shows liberals and conservatives display identical magnitudes of confirmation bias in opposite directions. Not similar. Identical. Whatever you've told yourself about which side is more reasonable, the neurology doesn't support it. The filter doesn't have political affiliations. It runs on everyone, equally, without exception, including you, especially you. If you're currently feeling like this probably applies more to other people, and it reaches into places you'd never expect to find it. Medical diagnosis. Doctors are smart, trained, and operating in a high-stakes environment where being wrong has immediate consequences. And yet, research on diagnostic reasoning shows that when a doctor forms an early hypothesis about what's wrong with a patient, they order tests that confirm that hypothesis at a significantly higher rate than tests that could rule it out. They're not being careless. They're doing exactly what Wason's subjects did. They found a plausible answer and started testing for rightness instead of testing for truth. The same filter, different room, higher stakes, legal judgment, scientific peer review, performance evaluations, hiring decisions. The Nickerson Review in 1998 cataloged the evidence across all of it, and the conclusion was the same every time. The bias operates across professions, cultures, education levels, and stakes. There is no domain where trained experts have been shown to be immune. There is no level of expertise that turns the filter off. What expertise sometimes provides is a more sophisticated vocabulary for explaining why the filter's output was correct all along. And that brings us to the cruelest part, the part that makes this genuinely hard. In research by Pronin and colleagues published in 2002, participants who were explicitly told about confirmation bias, who understood what it was and how it worked, showed no measurable improvement in their subsequent decision-making. Zero. Awareness alone does nothing. You can know this is happening and still do it at full strength, because knowing about the filter is not the same as redesigning the filter. Your brain hears the information about confirmation bias, processes it through the existing confirmation bias, and produces a thought that sounds like, yes, that's real, and I should watch out for it in others. So what actually works? Not willpower, not information, structure, external systems that force disconfirming information through before a decision closes. The countermeasures that research actually supports are boring and deliberate and slightly uncomfortable. which is exactly what you should expect from something that works against a built-in cognitive preference. The premortem, developed by the researcher Gary Klein, is one of them. Before you commit to a decision, you assume it has already failed. Not might fail, has failed. And you generate specific reasons why. Not vague risks, specific narratives of failure. This forces the brain to construct the disconfirming story it would otherwise never tell itself, because you framed failure as the premise rather than the threat. You're not asking it to consider that you might be wrong. You're telling it you were wrong and demanding it explain how. That framing matters. The brain will comply where it would otherwise resist. Steel manning is another one. Not considering the other side. Everyone claims to do that, and almost no one does it honestly. But specifically, articulating the opposing position in its strongest form. Not the weak version, not the straw man. The version that an intelligent, informed person who disagrees with you would actually make. If you can't state it in a way that person would recognize as fair, you haven't done it. Most people discover, when they genuinely try this, that they've been arguing against a version of the opposing view that no serious proponent of it would recognize. Galinsky and Musweiler found in 2000 that explicitly generating reasons why a belief might be wrong, not might be complicated, specifically wrong, reduced confirmation effects in controlled experiments. Consider the opposite strategy. It sounds simple. It is simple. It works precisely because it's the opposite of what your brain wants to do, which means it's actively recruiting processing that the filter would otherwise skip entirely. Timing matters for the outsider audit. Consulting someone who disagrees with you before a decision is made produces different results than consulting them after. After the decision, you're already in rationalization mode. The filter is defending a position that now has identity attached to it. Before, there's still a window, a small one. But it's there. None of these are comfortable. All of them require you to do something your brain finds mildly threatening, which is to actively construct the case against yourself before someone else does it for you. That discomfort is the point. That's the friction that the filter can't smooth away automatically. You're not outsmarting the bias. You're building scaffolding around the decision that the bias can't quietly dismantle while you're not looking. Here's what you actually walked away with, and it isn't what you think. You didn't learn that you're irrational. You didn't learn that your opinions are wrong or that your conclusions can't be trusted. That's not what this is. What you learned is that the brain you're using to evaluate the world was built for a different job than the one you're asking it to do. It was built for speed, for coherence, for keeping a functioning model of reality intact under pressure so you could keep moving without freezing up every time new information arrived. That's not a flaw. That's engineering. Remarkable engineering, actually, that kept human beings alive and functional for a very long time in conditions that would end you in a weekend. The problem isn't the brain. The problem is the mismatch. You're running hardware optimized for fast, coherent, good enough decisions in a world that now rewards slow, accurate, occasionally uncomfortable ones. The filter was a feature. It just became a liability the moment the cost of being wrong stopped being a bad afternoon and started being a bad decade. Think about what that argument looked like at the start. Two people in a room. Different information you assumed. Different facts, different sources, different conclusions. That's the intuitive model. That's what it feels like from the inside. But now you know what was actually happening. Same information, processed twice through two different versions of the same filter, arriving at two pre-existing destinations with their certainty intact and their opposition reinforced. It wasn't a disagreement. It was two confirmation loops running simultaneously in the same room, and neither person inside a loop can see the loop from the inside. That's not a metaphor. That's the structural reality of what argument usually is. Two closed systems generating heat. You were in that room too. You are always in that room. The question is just whether you know it. Here's what changes when you know it. Not everything. Not immediately. You don't get a switch to flip, a setting to change, a mode to enter where the filter stops running. The filter always runs. What you get instead is a narrow window, a gap between the filter's output and your response to it. And in that gap, if you're paying attention and you've built the right habits, you can insert a question. Just one. It doesn't have to be complicated. The question is, what would it take for me to be wrong about this? not could I be wrong. Could I be wrong is a question the filter answers instantly and confidently with no. What would it take is different. That question demands specifics. It demands construction. It makes your brain build the failure scenario instead of dismiss it, and building is harder to shortcut than dismissing. That's the gap the pre-mortem exploits. That's why Galinsky and Musweiler found what they found. The consider the opposite instruction works not because it makes you more open-minded in some vague motivational sense, but because it recruits cognitive effort in a direction the filter actively avoids. You're not overriding the filter, you're routing around it. The steelman is the same principle at a different scale. Most of the time, when people say they've considered the other side, what they've actually done is considered a weakened, slightly cartoonish version of the other side that was easy to dismiss. That's my side bias in action. You built the opposition out of balsa wood so you could knock it over and feel rigorous. Steelmanning forces you to build it out of the strongest available materials, forces you to find the best version of the argument against you. And here's what happens when you do that honestly. Sometimes the best version of the argument against you is actually pretty good. Sometimes it's better than your position. And the only way to find that out is to build it faithfully and look at it without flinching. That's not comfortable. It was never going to be comfortable. Comfort is what the filter sells you. The filter is a comfort machine. It makes the world legible and familiar and confirms that you've been roughly right all along, and it does this so smoothly and so constantly that you never notice you're paying for it. You pay in blind spots, in bad investments held too long, in relationships that quietly calcified around an early misreading that nobody ever corrected because the evidence kept getting sorted to match, in jobs that weren't right and years that passed while the accumulating proof of that was steadily filed away somewhere you never looked. Those costs are real. They're not abstract, and they're highest precisely where you felt most certain you were being objective. Money, professional judgment, the big rational decisions where you did your research and weighed your options and arrived at a considered conclusion. The filter had the most room to work in those moments because your guard was lowest. You were being careful. You were being thorough. You were, without knowing it, being thorough in the service of what you already believed. So here's what you do with all of this. Not what you feel, what you do. Before the next significant decision, you run the pre-mortem. You tell yourself it failed. You demand to know why. You write it down if you can, because writing forces specificity in a way that thinking alone doesn't. And specificity is where rationalizations fall apart. Before the next argument that matters, you build the steelman, the real one. The one that would actually be convincing to a smart person who disagreed with you. And before you finalize anything, high stakes, hiring someone, making a financial move, ending or beginning something important, you consult someone who will push back before the decision is made, not after. Timing, before. That part isn't optional. Post-decision consultation is just an audience for your rationalization. Pre-decision consultation is actual input. And when you remove the name from the resume, the identifying details from the performance review, the personal history from the judgment, when you strip away the information that gives the filter something to grip, you will find that your evaluations change. That's not a theory. Blind auditions in orchestras measurably increased the proportion of women hired when screens were introduced, documented across multiple major orchestras in research spanning decades. The bias didn't go away when the screen went up. The pathway did. That's the distinction that matters. You're not curing anything. You're blocking the route. Now go back to that room one more time. The argument. The two people who had already decided. You see it differently now. You see that the person across from you wasn't being unreasonable or dishonest or deliberately difficult. They were running the same filter you were running, on the same information you both had access to, arriving at their pre-existing destination exactly as smoothly and invisibly as you arrived at yours. And neither of you could see it. That's not a reason to give up on the conversation. It's a reason to have a different kind of conversation. One where you go in, already having built the best version of their argument. One where you've already asked yourself what it would take for you to be wrong. One where you're not scanning for ammunition because you've already done the harder work of genuinely testing your own position before they had to do it for you. That's what thinking clearly actually requires. Not more information, not more intelligence, not more conviction that you're one of the rational ones. Structure. Deliberate, slightly uncomfortable pre-built structure that processes disconfirming information before the loop closes. The loop is always trying to close. It closed in that argument at the start. It closes in every boardroom and every doctor's office and every relationship that slowly became a story one person was telling about the other without updating the text. It closes fast and clean and you almost never feel it happen. But now you have a name for it. And the next time you're certain, genuinely, comfortably, completely certain, that's the moment to pause. That certainty is the filter talking. That smoothness is the loop closing. And in the gap before you respond, there's a question waiting, one you now know how to ask.